The Unpaid Ledger, Episode 7, Borrowed Time, Chapter 1, 46 Hours. I woke up on the floor of my apartment with no memory of how I got there. Not the couch, where I'd collapsed after Derek drove me home. The floor. Specifically, the strip of hardwood between the kitchen and the living room, which smelled like dust and old takeout, and the particular brand of failure that comes from living alone in a building that should have been condemned. My hands were still shaking. Not as bad as last night, but enough that when I tried to push myself up, my left arm buckled and I ate floor again. Smooth, Eddie said from somewhere above me, his voice carrying the particular blend of amusement and concern that only a dead man could manage. How long was I out? I asked, rolling onto my back and staring at the ceiling. 14 hours. You fell off the couch around 3 a.m. I was going to say something, but you looked so peaceful, sprawled on the floor, drooling. I don't drool, I said, finally getting an elbow underneath me. You drool. Eddie said it with the certainty of a man who'd been watching me sleep for 7 years and had the receipts to prove it. I got up on the second try. The apartment spun, steadied, spun again. My vision was still wrong, not doubled anymore, but everything had a slight delay, like the world was rendering a half-second behind where it should be. Neural degradation. Lena's clinical term for what happened when you absorb 10% of a fatal genetic disease into your own nervous system. Fun times. The gift that kept on giving, apparently. My phone was on the counter. I'd missed 6 calls. 2 from April, 3 from Lena, 1 from Marcus. Marcus's voicemail was 8 seconds long, which was either efficiency or panic. And with Marcus, it was hard to tell the difference. The crystal is singing, young man. That's not a metaphor. Call me. I called him back, bracing the phone against my ear with a shoulder that didn't want to cooperate. How bad? I said, leaning against the counter to keep myself upright. Worse than I projected. Marcus's voice was strained in a way I didn't like. Marcus never sounded strained. Marcus sounded like smooth jazz on a Sunday morning, even when the world was ending. The crystal vessel is degrading faster than anticipated. The cost inside is dense, compressed genetic material. It doesn't want to be contained. It wants to be somewhere. How long? I asked, gripping the phone tighter than I needed to. I told you 48 to 72 hours. I'm revising that estimate downward. How far downward? I asked, already dreading the answer. Silence. The kind that meant he was deciding how much truth I could handle. End of day tomorrow. Maybe. If I don't sleep, don't eat, and spend every waking moment reinforcing the binding. Another pause. I'm running out of reinforcement, Sam. This isn't like the silver vessel from the university. That was diffuse, spread out. This is concentrated, singular. One cost, one disease, compressed into a space the size of my fist. It pushes back. My hands shook. I braced them against the counter. I'll figure something out, I said, though even I could hear how thin the words sounded. Figure it out fast. Marcus hung up without waiting for a reply, which told me more about how scared he was than anything he'd actually said. Eddie was watching me from across the kitchen. Solid. More solid than usual. He'd been like that since the university, since half the entity went into the silver vessel and the other half went into the building's bones. Something about all those costs moving through me had strengthened whatever tether kept him in the world. You look terrible, he said, studying my face with an expression that was almost clinical. Thanks, I said, turning toward the coffee maker before he could catalog any more of my symptoms. The shaking's better, though. Last night, you couldn't hold a phone. Now you can probably hold one if you concentrate really hard. Progress? I said, fumbling the coffee filter out of the cabinet and nearly dropping it twice. That's the spirit. Low bar, high enthusiasm. He watched me fumble with the coffee maker. At this rate, you'll be functional by Thursday, just in time for the crystal to explode. I poured coffee, spilled half of it, drank the rest. It was cold and terrible, which meant it was the same as always. We need a plan, I said, setting the mug down harder than necessary. We need a miracle. Plan is a strong word for what we have. A plan is what happens before the miracle. I pulled Marcus's message up on my phone, played it again. The crystal is singing. We've got maybe 30 hours. The cost needs to go somewhere. Somewhere it can settle without hurting anyone. Back to Kovac? He's still dying in prison, Eddie suggested, drifting closer to the counter. Bellamy prepped him. Anything we do with Kovac, she's watching, I said, shaking my head. So we find another target. Someone terminal. Someone who won't notice an extra disease. That's not how I work, I said, and the words came out harder than I intended. It's a little bit how you work. You just feel worse about it than most. Eddie's voice was light, almost teasing. The ethics are flexible. You just keep them on a shorter leash than Cobb did. He wasn't wrong. That was the worst part. The line between me and Cobb was thinner than I like to admit, and Eddie could see it from the other side. My phone rang again. Lena's name on the screen, which meant the morning was about to get worse. Sam, I need to see you. My sensors picked up anomalous readings from the crystal vessel overnight. Marcus sent me the data. There are fluctuations I can't explain, and I need to take measurements while the vessel is still intact. Can it wait? I asked, rubbing my temple with my free hand. That depends. How do you feel about uncontrolled cost dispersal in a densely populated city? I'll be there in an hour, I said, already reaching for my coat. Make it 30 minutes. She hung up before I could argue, which seemed to be a theme this morning. I looked at Eddie. Popular morning, he said, one corner of his mouth twitching upward. Regular social butterfly. I grabbed my coat. My keys jangled in my shaking hand. The morning light through my kitchen window was thin and gray, the kind of light that made Ashford look like an old photograph of itself. February in this city. The river would be cold. The streets would be wet. And somewhere, a crystal full of compressed genetic disease was counting down to zero. Chapter 2. The Singing Crystal. Marcus's shop smelled wrong, and I knew it the moment I walked through the door. Not the usual wrong. Not the comfortable residue of traded costs and stored consequences that gave second chances its particular atmosphere. This was sharper, metallic, like ozone before a lightning strike, mixed with something organic, something alive. The crystal vessel sat on Marcus's workbench in the back room, surrounded by a containment circle that looked like it had been redrawn 3 times. Candles at each point, all of them burning with flames that leaned toward the crystal instead of straight up, fighting gravity to get closer to the thing that was killing them. Lena was already there, tablet out, sensors positioned around the room in a grid pattern. She looked like she hadn't slept either, but on her it manifested as sharper focus instead of stumbling. Some people ran better when they were exhausted, academics mostly. The vessel's resonance frequency has shifted 12% since last night, she said without looking up. The binding Marcus applied is holding, but the cost inside is testing it. Probing. Like water finding cracks in a dam. Costs don't probe, I said, stepping closer to look at her screen. This one does. Lena showed me her tablet. Waveforms that looked almost rhythmic, almost intentional. Genetic material is different from acute costs. Injuries want to land and settle. Deaths want to complete. But genetic disease is ongoing. It's a process, not an event. It's still running, Sam. Still executing. Inside that crystal, Maya's Batten disease is trying to progress. Trying to degrade neurons that aren't there. Hungry, Marcus said from the doorway. He was holding a cup of tea that he hadn't touched. His eyes were bloodshot. His vest was wrinkled, which was the equivalent of anyone else showing up naked. It's hungry, and it doesn't have anything to eat. That's what makes it dangerous. Eddie drifted through the containment circle, stopped, drifted back out. That's unpleasant, he said, shaking his translucent form like a dog coming out of water. Like walking through a cloud of angry bees, if the bees were made of neurological decay. He drifted further from the circle. 0 stars. Would not recommend. Can you be more specific? Lena asked. She still couldn't see Eddie, but she'd learned to listen for him. It's dense, thick, and it's aware of Sam. When I passed through, I could feel it reaching. Not like the entity, not hunting, More like recognition. It knows where it came from. Marcus set down his untouched tea with a quiet clink against the workbench. That's the problem with genetic costs. They're personal, connected to the source. Maya's disease knows Sam touched it, moved it. It wants to go back to her, and failing that, it wants the next closest thing. Me, I said, and the word hung in the air between us like smoke. You. Marcus looked at me over the rims of reading glasses I'd never seen him wear. The man was falling apart, which is why you need to stay away from it. You've already absorbed 10%. If that crystal breaks while you're standing next to it, the remaining 80% lands on you, and your system is already compromised. What about diffusion? Lena asked, not looking up from her tablet. Break the cost down into smaller fragments. Disperse it across a wide area, a building, a park. Spread thin enough, the individual impact would be negligible. I considered that. Marcus shook his head slowly, the gesture carrying the weight of a man who'd already run through every option and come up empty. Genetic disease doesn't diffuse cleanly. It wants to stay whole. Break it apart, and the fragments seek each other. Reassemble. You'd have a week, maybe two, before it reconstituted on the nearest viable host. So we can't contain it, can't diffuse it, can't target it without Bellamy watching. I leaned against the wall, keeping distance from the crystal. What can we do? We can let it dissipate, Lena said carefully, choosing each word like she was placing stones across a stream. Open the vessel in a controlled environment. Let the cost release into the general ledger. No specific target, no anchor. Just let it go. Does that work? I asked, turning to Marcus for the answer. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I noticed the candle flames had shifted again, all pointing toward me now instead of the crystal, like I was the stronger pull. Theoretically, Marcus said, cost without a target will seek equilibrium, spread out, thin to nothing over time, like smoke in a large room. But? I asked, because there was always a but with Marcus, and usually it was the part that mattered most. But I've never tried it with something this concentrated. There's a risk it doesn't thin out, a risk it finds an anchor on its own, someone walking by, a child, an elderly person, someone weak enough for it to latch onto. Hey, met my eyes. Can you live with that risk? No, I said, and the word came out flat and final, leaving no room for negotiation. Then we need another option. Marcus pulled a chair out, sat down heavily, looking his age for once. And we need it before tomorrow night. Lena was studying her tablet again, tapping, scrolling. That look on her face that meant the numbers were telling her something she wasn't ready to say out loud. What? I asked, watching her expression shift from concentration to something closer to unease. Something anomalous in the sensor data from last night during Marcus's reinforcement. She turned the tablet toward me. A graph. 2 lines. One showing the crystal vessel's energy output. One showing ambient ledger activity in the room. The crystal is losing containment energy at a consistent rate. That's expected. But look at the ambient readings. I looked. The second line showed a gradual decrease in ambient ledger activity around the vessel. Not an increase, which is what you'd expect from a leaking container. A decrease. Something's absorbing it? I said, tracing the downward slope with my finger. Something nearby is drawing cost out of the environment. Passively. Not actively pulling. More like a low-pressure zone in weather. Energy naturally flows toward it. She looked at me. The absorption center is consistent with your position in the shop during yesterday's visit. You're saying I'm pulling costs out of the air, I said, letting my hand drop from the tablet. I'm saying the data suggests a passive absorption effect centered on you. Whether that's a function of the 10% you already carry or something else entirely, I can't determine without more data. The candle flames leaned toward me. All of them. Even the ones on the far side of the room. Fascinating, Lena said, watching the flames bend in my direction with the hungry eyes of a scientist witnessing something unprecedented. Chapter 3. The Warehouse. We reconvened at Derek's warehouse that afternoon. Everyone except Miriam, who was still maintaining cover at the bureau. She'd sent a text through the burner phone Derek had given her. Road silent. Or Staley. Be careful. Derek had cleared his main table. No maps this time. No files. Just the crystal vessel in the center, humming faintly. Its surface clouded with frost, despite the warehouse being warm. Marcus had wrapped it in protective cloth and set it inside a silver-lined box. But even through the layers, I could feel it. And it could feel me. I knew that the way you know someone's watching you in a dark room, a certainty that lives in the spine. Walk me through the options, Derek said. He stood with his back to the wall, arms crossed, the way he always stood when someone was about to suggest something he didn't like. Option 1, Lena said, pulling up her tablet. Controlled release. Open the vessel. Let the cost dissipate into the general ledger. Risk. It latches onto a random civilian. Marcus rates the probability at 30 to 40%. Too high, Derek said, shaking his head once. Sharp and definitive. Option 2, Lena continued, undeterred. Find a willing target. Someone terminal who consents to accepting the cost. That's Kovac with extra steps, I said, leaning forward in my chair. And Bellamy's watching him. Option 3. Lena paused, and the silence in the warehouse stretched tight enough to snap. Sam absorbs it. The room went quiet in the way. Rooms go quiet when someone says the thing everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to hear. No, April said immediately. She'd been standing by the window, monitoring the street. She turned around, and her expression had gone from watchful to furious in the space of a single heartbeat. He already took 10%, and it nearly killed him. Taking the rest would be fatal. Not necessarily, Lena said, her voice measured and clinical in the way it got when she was presenting data she knew would be unpopular. Based on the data from last night, Sam is already passively absorbing residual cost from the crystal's proximity. His system is processing it without acute damage. If the absorption could be managed, controlled, titrated gradually, rather than all at once. You're talking about feeding him a fatal disease in small bites, April said, stepping away from the window. That's insane. I'm talking about what the data suggests is already happening naturally, Lena replied, meeting April's glare without flinching. Eddie appeared next to the crystal. Solid. He studied it for a moment, then looked at me. Hey, Sam, he said, his voice carrying a weight that didn't match the casual greeting. Yeah, I said, knowing from his tone that whatever came next would be important. Remember when our biggest problem was a broken pocket watch? Fondly, I said, and meant it more than I wanted to admit. Good times. He circled the vessel, keeping distance. So here's the thing. That crystal in there? It's not just sitting. It's leaking. And the leak isn't going into the room. It's going, he pointed at me, that way. I can feel the current. Faint. Steady. Like a draft under a door. Lena nodded, glancing at her sensor readings. Consistent with my sensor readings. The question isn't whether Sam can absorb it, Eddie continued, his translucent form flickering as he moved away from the crystal's influence. He's already absorbing it. The question is whether we let the crystal explode and dump everything at once, or whether we find a way to speed up what's already happening. Controlled. You're both insane, April said, her voice tight with frustration. He's dead, and I'm an academic, Lena replied, not looking up from her tablet. Insanity is relative. Marcus had been silent. Sitting in the corner, hands folded, watching the conversation like a man at a poker table studying everyone's tells. Young man, he said finally, his voice cutting through the debate like a blade through cloth. To me, come here. I walked over. He reached up, took my wrist, held it for a moment. His fingers were warm, steady. The hands of a man who'd held dangerous things for half a century. You feel different, he said, turning my hand slightly, as if reading something written beneath my skin. Different how? I asked, watching his face for any sign of what he was finding. Heavier. Not physically. The ledger around you has changed. Last week you were hollow, a gap. Costs fell into you and vanished. Now, He turned my hand over, studying my palm like there was something written there. Now you're full. Not overflowing. Not breaking. Full. Like a vessel that's found its capacity. That doesn't make sense, I said, though something in my chest tightened at the words. Some recognition I wasn't ready to name. No, it doesn't. Marcus let go. But I've been in this business longer than anyone in this room has been alive. And I've learned that the ledger doesn't always make sense. Sometimes it just works. He looked at the crystal. That cost in there. It's been reaching for you since you first touched it. Not because you're its target, because you're something else. Something else, I repeated, the words tasting strange in my mouth, like a language I was only beginning to learn. I don't have a word for it, but whatever you are, Samuel, you're not just an adjuster who can make costs disappear. You're somewhere costs can go, somewhere they can be. Him at my eyes. The question is whether there's a bottom. The warehouse was silent except for the crystal's faint hum and the distant sound of traffic outside. Everyone looking at me, waiting for a decision. Derek moved first, not toward me, toward the crystal. He crouched next to the table, studying the frost patterns on the vessel's surface with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent years reading ledger signatures. During my time at the bureau, he said, not looking up, we had a term for costs that gravitated towards specific people, called them addressed, like mail that knows where it's going. He straightened. I've never seen a cost this clearly addressed. Whatever you're about to decide, Sam, that thing already made its choice. Open it, I said, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt, which was either courage or stupidity, and I'd figure out which one later. Sam? April started, stepping forward with her hand half raised, as if she could physically stop what was about to happen. Open it. Here. Now. While it's controlled. While Marcus is here to monitor. While Lena has her sensors running. I stepped toward the crystal. The humming grew louder. Warmer. If it's going to come to me anyway, I'd rather it happen on my terms. Not in the middle of the night when the crystal shatters and 80% of Batten disease goes looking for a home. Derek unfolded his arms and met my eyes, searching for hesitation. Are you sure? No, I said, holding his gaze despite the doubt crawling up my spine. But I'm running out of time to not be sure. Marcus stood, adjusted his vest, smoothed his collar. The old ritual. The preparation of a man about to do serious work. Chapter 4. The Opening. Marcus removed the protective cloth with the care of a surgeon. The crystal sat on the table, naked now, pulsing with a light that wasn't quite light, more like the absence of shadow. The frost on its surface had thickened, forming patterns that looked almost like neurons, branching, splitting, reaching. When I break the seal, the cost will release, Marcus said, his voice dropping into the low, measured register he reserved for moments when precision was the difference between success and catastrophe. Based on what we've observed, it should be drawn toward you. But there's no precedent for what we're attempting. If it doesn't work, if it disperses into the room, I'll try to recapture it. I have a secondary vessel prepared. And if you can't recapture it? I asked, watching the frost pattern shift on the crystal surface. Then we have a very bad evening, Marcus said, straightening the silver-lined cloth beneath the vessel. Worse than most of my evenings? I asked, trying for humor and landing somewhere closer to genuine curiosity. Considerably, Marcus said, and the flatness of his delivery told me he wasn't joking even a little. Eddie positioned himself between me and the door, not blocking it. Just there. The way he always was when things went wrong. Close enough to matter, far enough to move. Lena had her tablet ready. Sensors recording. Temperature gauges, electromagnetic monitors, and 3 devices I couldn't name that blinked and hummed with their own quiet urgency. April stood by Derek. He'd moved her there without a word. Protective instinct. She hadn't argued. She was learning when to push and when to let the professionals work. Ready? Marcus asked, his finger hovering above the crystal's surface. I placed my hands flat on the table, 6 inches from the crystal, close enough to feel the cold rolling off it in waves. Do it, I said, and steadied myself against whatever was about to happen. Marcus touched the crystal with one finger, whispered something I couldn't hear. The language was old, older than English, older than anything I could name. The kind of words that existed before words existed, back when the ledger was young and the balance was simple. The crystal cracked. The sound was clean and final, like a bone breaking in a silent room. Not shattered, cracked. A single clean line running from top to bottom, splitting it perfectly in two. The light inside poured out, not into the room, not scattering the way released costs normally scattered. It moved like water finding a channel, flowing along the table surface, pooling, moving toward my hands with the slow, certain inevitability of water finding the lowest point in a room. I felt it before it touched me. The cold, the density. 80% of a fatal genetic disease, compressed and concentrated and hungry. It reached my fingertips, and I braced for pain. It didn't hurt. That was the part that scared me most. The cost flowed into me like water into sand. No resistance, no burning, no echo of dying neurons or failing pathways. Just absorption. Quiet, steady, natural, in a way that nothing about my abilities had ever felt natural. Lena's sensors went haywire. Every screen flickered. Every reading spiked. She was tapping furiously, trying to capture data that was breaking her equipment. Temperature dropping, she reported, her voice tight with controlled excitement. Ambient ledger activity falling. The cost is being absorbed completely. No dispersal, no residual signature. It's just going in. Marcus watched with an expression I'd never seen on him. Not fear, not fascination, something closer to recognition. Like he'd been waiting to see this and hoping he never would. The crystal's light faded. The two halves sat on the table, empty now, inert, just quartz. I sat down heavily in the nearest chair, and the room was very quiet. The kind of quiet that follows something nobody has a name for. Eddie drifted closer, studied me. His form flickered once, then steadied. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice careful in a way that told me he was bracing for a bad answer. I took stock. My hands, still shaking from yesterday's damage, but no worse. My vision, still slightly delayed, but no change. My thoughts, scattered, slow, foggy from the 10% I'd already been carrying. But underneath all of that, something new, something settled. Like a room that had been empty and was now furnished, not crowded, not overwhelmed, just occupied. 80% of a fatal genetic disease was inside me now. I couldn't feel it. Not the way I'd felt the 10% yesterday with the tremors and the cognitive fog. This was different, deeper, like it had found a place to be that wasn't my nervous system, somewhere else inside me, somewhere costs went when they vanished. "I feel fine," I said, and heard the disbelief in my own voice. "You feel fine," April repeated, her tone flat and disbelieving, the words landing like accusations. "Yeah," I said, flexing my fingers as if to prove it to both of us. "You just absorbed enough genetic disease to kill 3 people, and you feel fine." I didn't say it made sense, I told her, because it didn't, and pretending otherwise would have been insulting to both of us. Lena was staring at her readings, her mouth slightly open in an expression I'd never seen on her before. "The cost isn't registering in your vitals. No additional neural degradation, no immune response, no metabolic changes. It's as if it entered your body and went somewhere else, somewhere my sensors can't read." "Where it always goes," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the gravity of a man watching a theory he'd held for decades crumble and reform into something he didn't recognize. "Into the gap, into the nowhere that Sam carries." Eddie was very still beside me. "Sam, when that cost came in, I felt it, in the gray space, like something heavy settling into the room next door." "Heavy?" I asked, turning to look at him, even though I knew the others could only hear one side of this conversation. Not threatening, not like the entity, more like he searched for words, his translucent hands gesturing vaguely at shapes only he could see, like furniture being delivered, new weight in a familiar space. Is it bothering you? I asked, watching his form for any sign of distress. No. Eddie sounded almost surprised by his own answer, tilting his head as if listening to something far away. It's just there, sitting, quiet. Lena was already running calculations, numbers appearing on her screen, graphs forming. The look on her face was pure academic hunger, the kind that came from witnessing something that shouldn't exist and needing to understand why it did. This changes everything, she said. Sam, if you can absorb costs directly without experiencing their effects, without physical degradation, that contradicts every model of ledger mechanics I've ever studied. Costs have to manifest somewhere. They have to affect something. They can't just exist in stasis. And yet, I said, holding up my steady hands as evidence. And yet, she met my eyes, and for the first time since I'd known her, Lena Chin looked shaken. You're not a loophole, Sam. Loopholes get closed. You're something the ledger doesn't have a category for. Somewhere costs can go. Somewhere they can be. Marcus's words, but the meaning ran deeper than he'd intended. The entity in the silver vessel was made from 5 years of costs that had gone into this same space. The gray space. Eddie's space. My space, apparently. But the entity was violent. Hungry. This was quiet. And Leland's voice on the radio. I know exactly where you'll send it. She'd known for 7 years. Whatever I was, she'd seen it that night at the river, and she'd been planning for it ever since. Nobody tells Bellamy about this, I said, and my voice came out harder than I intended, edged with something close to fear. Nobody tells anyone. As far as the world knows, the crystal dissipated on its own, and the costs scattered into the environment. Sam, Lena started, her tablet half raised in protest. Nobody, I said, and the word filled the warehouse like a door slamming shut. She closed her mouth, and after a long moment, she nodded once, the kind of nod that meant she disagreed but understood. April hadn't moved from Derek's side. Her arms were crossed, her jaw tight, the look of someone processing something they didn't want to accept. The readings, she said, her voice controlled but brittle. From the university, from the entity. Those costs accumulated into something destructive, something that hunted you. How do we know this is different? We don't, I said, meeting her eyes and giving her the honesty she deserved, even though it wasn't comforting. Great. Wonderful. So for all we know, you just swallowed a bomb, and we're all standing in the blast radius. April, I said, keeping my voice gentle because she wasn't wrong, and we both knew it. I'm being practical, Sam. Someone has to be. Her voice cracked on the last word, just barely, just enough for me to hear. Derek spoke for the first time since the crystal opened, his voice cutting through the tension with the precision of a man who knew exactly which question mattered most. How's the silver vessel? Marcus checked his phone, something he'd rigged to monitor the larger vessel remotely. Stable. No change. The entity half isn't reacting to what just happened. Different container, Lena murmured, almost to herself, already building new frameworks from the rubble of the old ones. Different mechanism. The entity formed from costs that had nowhere to go. This cost found somewhere to go. She was scribbling on her tablet, notes for herself, theory building in real time. If Sam's anomaly has always been a destination rather than a void, then the entity isn't overflow from a full container. It's the result of costs that arrived before the container was ready to hold them. English, Doc, Eddie said, drifting closer to peer at her tablet, even though the data meant nothing to him. The entity might be scar tissue, from a wound that's healing. She looked up, blinked. Metaphorically, I think. Marcus picked up the empty crystal halves, turned them over in his hands, held them up to the light. Nothing left inside, just quartz. Pretty, if you didn't know what it had held. I knew a woman. Marcus said, quiet. The way he spoke when he was reaching back into decades of memory. Ajoke, Nigerian, worked the Gold Coast in the 60s. Before my time, but I heard the stories. She could hold costs the way a river holds rain. Adjusters came from 3 countries to study her. He set the crystal down. She's dead now. Natural causes. Lived to 94. But the costs she held never manifested, never formed entities, never came due. They just stayed. What happened to them when she died? I asked, leaning forward despite myself. Nobody knows. Some people believe they dissolved. Others think they passed into the ledger and dispersed naturally. Marcus met my eyes. She didn't have a word for what she was either. Chapter 5. The Visitor. I slept hard that night. No dreams, no static from the radio, just black, empty sleep. The kind my body demanded when it had been through too much and needed to rebuild. When I woke up, my hands had stopped shaking, and for a long moment I just lay there, waiting for the tremors to return. Not reduced. Stopped. The tremors from Maya's 10%, the ones Lena said would take 3 to 5 days to resolve, were gone. 18 hours after they'd started. I flexed my fingers, made a fist, opened it, steady as stone. My vision had cleared too. No more delay. No more rendering lag. The world was sharp and immediate, the way it should be. I sat on the edge of my mattress and waited for something to hurt. Nothing did. Well, Eddie said from the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed and something like relief in his expression. Someone looks better. I feel better. That doesn't make sense, I said, staring down at my perfectly steady hands as if they belonged to someone else. Nothing about you makes sense. At this point, I've stopped keeping score. I got dressed, made coffee, drank it without spilling, which felt like a victory. Called Marcus. The crystal dispersed cleanly, I told him, keeping my voice neutral and professional. Lena's checking residual readings, but everything looks stable. Marcus was quiet for a moment. And how are you, young man? Better. Tremors are gone, I said, flexing my free hand just to feel the steadiness of it. Another pause, the kind Marcus used when he was weighing a word against all the other words he could have chosen. Interesting. That's one word for it, I said, and I could practically hear him choosing not to say the other words he had in mind. I have several. Most of them aren't appropriate for polite conversation. I heard him pouring something. Tea, probably. I'll monitor the silver vessel. Make sure the entity half isn't showing sympathy effects. With this much cost moving through you in 24 hours, there could be ripple effects. How's the silver holding? I asked, settling into my desk chair. Stable. For now, that one at least is behaving as expected. Small mercies, I said, and meant it more than the words probably conveyed. The only kind we get, Marcus replied, and I could hear the sad smile in his voice before he hung up. I was on my 3rd cup of coffee and my first attempt at actual paperwork when someone knocked on my office door. Not the tentative knock of a new client, not the professional precision of Miriam Tate, something in between, casual but deliberate. Eddie went still in that particular way of his, the translucent edges of his form sharpening like a dog catching a scent. Sam, he said, his voice dropping to the low register he used when something was wrong. I hear it, I said, already setting down my pen and straightening in my chair. There's someone in the hall. I didn't hear them come up the stairs. 3 flights of stairs in a building with no elevator. Wooden steps that creaked like artillery fire under anything heavier than a cat. Nobody came up those stairs without announcing themselves. I opened the desk drawer. Not a weapon inside. Just habit. Reaching for something solid. It's open, I called, keeping my hand near the desk drawer out of habit more than strategy. The door swung in, slow and deliberate, pushed by someone who was in no hurry at all. Dr. Adrian Cross stood in my doorway. Same as before. Mid-40s. Professional. The kind of calm that came from knowing things other people didn't. He wore a dark coat over a gray suit, and he carried nothing. No tablet, no sensors, No recording equipment, just himself, which was somehow more unsettling than if he'd brought an arsenal. Mr. Vance, you look well. Better than expected, given what you put yourself through 2 days ago. I recover fast, I said, leaning back in my chair with a casualness I didn't entirely feel. Apparently, he glanced around my office. The water stains, the filing cabinet, the window facing a brick wall. Charming. Everyone says that. Have a seat, I said, gesturing to the client chair while studying his face for any sign of what had brought him here. He didn't sit. He stood in the center of my office, hands in his pockets, studying me the way a doctor studies a patient who's showing symptoms that don't match any diagnosis. I'm here on my own, he said. Not recording, not transmitting. My employer doesn't know I'm here. And I should believe that because? I asked, keeping my expression neutral. Because if she knew I was here, I wouldn't be. She doesn't approve of freelancing. A faint smile. I have questions, Mr. Vance. Professional curiosity. The data from 2 days ago raised more questions than it answered. Eddie materialized fully, visible. Cross's eyes tracked to him without surprise. Mr. Lusk, a pleasure, Cross said, inclining his head slightly in Eddie's direction. We've met? Eddie said, narrowing his eyes at the man who apparently knew his name. I've studied you extensively. Your continued existence is one of the more interesting data points in Mr. Vance's file. Cross turned back to me. The trilateral dispersal was impressive. Taking cost into yourself was unexpected. But the crystal vessel, that was the interesting part. My chest tightened. The crystal dissipated on its own, I said, keeping my voice level through sheer force of will. No, it didn't. Cross said it simply, without accusation. My monitoring equipment may have been disconnected from your warehouse, but I have other instruments. Ambient ledger sensors throughout Ashford. The cost signature for concentrated Batten disease has a very specific profile. When your crystal broke, that signature didn't scatter into the city. It vanished. Completely. Instantaneously. Equipment malfunction, I said, though we both knew neither of us believed it. Mr. Vance. Cross pulled a hand from his pocket, held up a small device. Silver, sleek, the size of a lighter. This measures localized cost density. Right now, standing 6 feet from you, it reads higher than baseline. Not dangerously, not even noticeably to most instruments, but measurably. You're heavier than you should be. I didn't respond. I held his gaze and let the silence do the work. You absorbed it, Cross said. Not just the 10% you took deliberately. All of it. The crystal didn't fail. You emptied it. Eddie moved between us. Not threatening, just present, his translucent form casting no shadow on the floor between my desk and where Cross stood. If you're not recording, why are you here? I asked, keeping my voice even. Because I've been studying ledger anomalies for 11 years, and I've never encountered anyone who could do what you do. And because my employer has plans for you that depend on a specific understanding of your abilities. He put the device away. That understanding may be wrong. Wrong how? I asked, watching his expression carefully. She believes you're a conduit, a channel. Costs go in one end and accumulate in a dead space, build pressure, eventually manifest as entities. Cross paused, letting the weight of the theory settle before he dismantled it. But that's not what happened with the crystal. Entities form from costs that have nowhere to go. If you absorbed Maya Brennan's disease without it joining the accumulation, without it feeding the entity, then you're not a conduit. Then what am I? I asked, and heard the genuine question underneath the challenge. That's what I'm trying to determine. He moved toward the door. I would suggest determining it before she does. Her plans depend on her model being correct. If it's not, he left the sentence unfinished. If it's not, I pressed, watching him reach for the doorknob. Cross opened the door and paused in the frame, silhouetted against the dim hallway light. Then she'll need a new plan. And new plans, in my experience, tend to be more aggressive than old ones. He walked out. His footsteps were silent on the stairs. Eddie drifted to the window, watched the street below. He didn't get in a car, Eddie reported, pressing close to the glass. Just walked around the corner and was gone. Same as the university. One day I'd like to meet someone from Bellamy's organization who uses normal transportation. I sat at my desk and stared at the wall, turning Cross's words over in my mind like stones in my pocket. He came here to warn you, Eddie said, drifting back from the window. Maybe, I said, though something in my gut agreed with Eddie's read. Or Leland sent him to see how you'd react. Unauthorized visit is a great cover for a field test. Eddie shrugged, his translucent shoulders rising and falling in a gesture that looked almost solid. Either way, we learned something, and so did he. Also possible, I said, leaning back in my chair and staring at the ceiling. Third option, both. He's genuinely curious and reporting back, Eddie said, settling into the client chair as if the weight of the conversation required sitting down. People can multitask. The office was quiet, the building settling around us. Someone on the second floor was playing music, muffled bass coming up through the floorboards. Normal sounds, normal life. Cross had come alone, unauthorized, to tell me that Leland's model of what I was might be wrong. That was either a warning or a trap or both. But the device he'd shown me, the localized cost density reader, that was real. And what it measured was real. I was heavier than I should be, carrying more than any adjuster should be able to carry. The candle flames in Marcus's shop. Lena's sensor readings. Eddie feeling costs settle into the gray space. Marcus's story about a woman in West Africa who held costs like a river holds rain. The costs I'd absorbed weren't just vanishing anymore. They were staying, settling, finding purchase inside me. Not into an entity, not into destruction, into something else. Something that felt, for the first time, like it had a purpose I couldn't name. My phone buzzed on the desk, and I picked it up to find a text from Lena. Sam, my overnight sensors show 0 residual baton signature in the warehouse. 0. Not trace amounts. 0. That's impossible. Need to run more tests. I typed back, my thumbs moving slowly as I chose the words. Tomorrow, I need to think. Thinking is my department. Come to the university. I'll bring coffee. I almost smiled. The woman could make even an impossible situation feel like a research opportunity, and somehow that was exactly what I needed. Eddie reappeared in the client chair, solid again, arms crossed. So, Cross is spooked. Cross is curious. There's a difference, I said, setting my phone down on the desk. Is there? Because curious people tell their bosses what they learn. And Cross's boss has been planning this for 7 years, based on a theory about what you are. Eddie sat in the client chair, solid, almost alive. If Cross is right, if Leland's theory is wrong, what happens when she finds out? Nothing good, I said, and the certainty of that settled over me like cold water. Chapter 6. Accounting. The sun went down over Ashford and I sat in my office, doing something I hadn't done in years. I was counting. Sitting in the dark with a pen and a legal pad, tallying up debts that no accountant would recognize. Not money, not clients, not the dwindling stack of business cards in my desk drawer. I was counting costs. Every job I'd taken since becoming a null entry. 5 years of cases. Some small, some catastrophic. Kevin Marsh's pocket watch. The collector. Nina Santos. The entity at the university. Maya Brennan. And dozens of smaller ones between. The jobs that didn't make the highlight reel. A cracked foundation here. A medical bill there. The quiet, unglamorous work of moving consequences from people who couldn't carry them to places that could. Most of those costs had landed where I put them. Buildings, objects, targets who deserved the weight. Normal adjusting. Normal work. But some of them hadn't. Some had gone into the gap. The nowhere. The gray space. 5 years of accumulated debt that Lena said would manifest as something catastrophic in 2.5 years. Except Maya's cost hadn't joined the pile. It had gone somewhere else. Settled. Quiet. Not building toward anything. not feeding the entity, just held. The difference was what terrified me. Because if I was changing, if whatever I was could now hold costs without them accumulating into something destructive, then the timeline was wrong. Lena's calculations were based on a model that might not apply anymore. And if the timeline was wrong, everything Leland had planned for was wrong too. You're brooding, Eddie said from across the darkening room. I'm thinking, I said, not turning from the wall. You're sitting in the dark, staring at a wall. That's brooding, he said, and I could hear the smirk even without looking. I hadn't noticed the sun going down. The office was dim, lit only by the streetlight outside my brick wall window and the faint glow of my phone screen. Cross said Leland thinks I'm a conduit. That costs pass through me and collect in a dead space. Build up, eventually explode. That's been the working theory, Eddie said, drifting closer until his faint glow added to the room's meager light. But the crystal cost didn't build up. It settled. Lena's readings confirm it. Zero residual. No entity feeding. No accumulation. So the theory's wrong, Eddie said, his voice quiet and serious now, the humor stripped away. Part of it, maybe. I leaned back. The chair creaked. Or maybe I'm wrong and it's all going to hit me at 3 a.m. like a freight train. Optimistic, Eddie said, though his tone suggested he didn't think so either. Realistic? I corrected, staring at the ceiling where water stains mapped continents that didn't exist. Eddie was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost the dry edge. Just for a second. When that cost came in today, into the gray space, I felt it arrive. And Sam, it wasn't like the other stuff. The other costs in here, the entity pieces, they're restless, angry, looking for somewhere to be. Maya's disease just sat down, like it found a chair. What does that mean? I asked, finally turning to face him in the dim light. I have no idea, but I've been living in this space for 7 years, and nothing has ever felt like that before. He paused, his form flickering with something that might have been uncertainty. Something about you is different, not new, like it was always there and just woke up. The radio crackled. My car, 3 blocks away. Faint. I could barely hear it through the window. Static. Then nothing. Just static. The kind that fills a frequency when something that used to be there has gone quiet. No voice this time. No message. No Leland. Just the empty hiss of a channel waiting to be used. Just the ledger, turning its pages, recalculating. I pulled out my phone. Typed a message to the team group chat April had set up last week. The one she called the liability group because she thought she was funny. Crystal handled. Everyone regroup tomorrow at Derek's. We need to talk about what comes next. April responded first. What comes next is you explaining what actually happened with that crystal. Derek's reply came a moment later, characteristically brief. Noon. Marcus responded next, and I could picture him already selecting boxes from the bakery on 4th Street. I'll bring pastries. Lena's message arrived last, and even through text I could feel her vibrating with the need to understand what had happened. And I'll bring data. I set down the phone, stood up. My legs were steady. My hands were still. My mind was clear for the first time in days. The 10% of Batten disease that had been destroying my nervous system was gone, absorbed into the same space as the 80%. Settled. Quiet. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt the particular unease of a man who'd been told his house was haunted and then realized the ghost was him. Eddie materialized by the door, his translucent form leaning against the frame the way he used to lean when he was alive. Going home? Going home, I said, grabbing my coat off the back of the chair and shrugging into it. Productive day. Nearly died. Absorbed a fatal disease. Had a mysterious visit from one of Leland's watchers. He faded to translucent, ready for the walk. Sam? Yeah? I said, pausing with my hand on the light switch. That cost that came in today, into wherever I live. Eddie's form flickered, the edges of him blurring and reforming as he searched for the right words. I felt it arrive, settle, different from the other stuff in there. I stopped with my hand on the doorknob, the cold brass grounding me against what I heard in his voice. I'd like to understand what this place is, what I am. A pause, and for the first time in years, Eddie sounded small. When you're ready? I know, I said, and the weight of all the answers I owed him pressed against my chest. Soon? He asked, his voice carrying a hope he usually kept hidden. Soon, I said, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in a long time. Eddie almost smiled, his translucent features shifting into something warm and tired and impossibly human. I've got nothing but time. Well, sort of. We walked out together, down 3 flights of complaining stairs, through a lobby that smelled like old mail and indifference, into the night where Ashford hummed and breathed and had no idea what was happening beneath its surface. Something had changed. The costs weren't vanishing anymore. They were settling. I didn't know what that meant, and the not knowing sat in my chest like a second heartbeat. But I was starting to suspect Leland didn't either. That thought didn't scare me. It scared me more. A woman who'd been planning for 7 years, suddenly wrong about what I was. That was a woman who'd improvise. Improvisation usually meant someone got hurt, and I had a pretty good idea who she'd aim for first.